Good morning. I'll be reading from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I even touch his garment, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd passing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they had said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came into the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Kids are dismissed at this time as well. Thanks, guys. Okay, well, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Nathan. My wife and I and our kids have made Lake Taps here our church home for a number of years, and it's my pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to lead us through this passage that was just read for us in Mark chapter 5. I'd like to begin by telling a story. Years ago, when my wife Brittany and I, we lived in Toronto, Canada, just down the street from the office where I worked at, and that's where I got my hair cut. And the person who owned the shop, who also cut my hair, was from Iran. She was born and raised there. And at different times when I get my hair cut, she would tell me different stories of what it was like to grow up in Iran. And I remember this one time when I was getting my hair cut, she told me, it was actually quite a moving story and disturbing story of how she had experienced abuse growing up, particularly in the 1970s. She was there as a young girl, and she lived through the revolution in Iran and then eventually escaped. But during that time, it was just highly tumultuous, and she told me how she had experienced abuse, verbal abuse at the hands of religious leaders. And I remember at this one point in our haircut, she put the scissors down and she just looked at me in the mirror, and she just continued on about how she had this abuse that had happened to her, and she was frustrated. And her end game, the landing point for her, was she was much happier without religion. That her life was much better without God. And she could not imagine a life within which God was included and her life was happy. The two didn't work. And I just listened to her. And then she picked up the scissors again, started cutting my hair. And I looked at her and I said, now it's always a risk, right? When you sort of go into evangelistic mode with a person who has scissors and they're using them on your head. But I looked at her and I said, but what if there were a God who loved us? What if there were a God who he forgave us when we did wrong? And I'm just about to go into like full on like appeal right there. And she stops me. And she says, ooh, I would like that God. I would like that kind of God. And we had a conversation about that, but the reason why I tell you that story is as I was looking at this passage of Mark 5, which is really combining two stories. They're both two stories that are related to each other. The sparks sort of fly between these two stories. When we look at this passage, we soon realize that it features as a type of microcosm as to what is happening in Mark's gospel. And it's this, that when you come to Jesus, you get a lot more than what you had bargained for. That there's an element of surprise, that he almost catches you off guard because you come to him with something, maybe a need or a question, and actually you get a lot more than what you had anticipated. So what I'd like to do for this morning as we look at this passage is first I want to sort of almost catch us up to speed, because Mark, as you can probably tell, he tells stories at breakneck speed. He gets a lot in. We're only in the 5th chapter and a lot has happened. So catch us up to where we're at in terms of a context standpoint. Then I want to look at this passage in more finer detail, almost like a blow-by-blow look. And then from there, I want to focus in on two questions that this passage actually answers. Two questions. The first question is, what does it mean to live with faith? Faith is such a misunderstood, it's a misused, it's overused word in our culture that we're not sure what it actually means when we even use the word. Then I want to look at how this passage speaks to the question of who is God and what is he like? Now, Brian, Gary, Pete have told us, and one of the big questions, the million-dollar question of Mark's gospel, and the gospels for that matter, is who do you say that I am? That is the question. If you get that right, it's almost like you get the thing. That is the business of Christianity. Who is this man? So we're going to look at not only what does this passage have to say to what is it like to live with faith, particularly in a time of fear. Both these people, by the way, Jairus and the woman, they're both actually full of fear. But what does that mean for us today when it comes to faith? And two, what does this tell us about the nature and character of God? Okay, so let me pray. Father, I pray that you'd speak to us in these moments. Help us to hear your voice. In your name, amen. So let's look at the context leading up to this story, okay? Now, remember, we're only in Mark 5, and Jesus has been busy. I mean, he's like really busy. We see, for one, he's healed many people, including a paralyzed man. He has delivered people from demonic possession. He has been accused. Now, this is interesting. In chapter 3, he's been accused by his own family to use a very diplomatic English translation in the ESV, out of his mind. Okay? Now, let me just cut to the chase here. That is very diplomatic, because for Jesus' family, how they've seen Jesus act, they actually think, to put it in our terms, they think the elevator does not go to the top anymore for Jesus. Okay, they think he's actually gone crazy. He's gone marbles. So that's what's happened to this point. Then we continue on. Jesus is then accused by, I think, religious people, scribes, for being demon-possessed. He has the prince of demons. Now, what's often missed for me, and I put my hands up at this, when we think of smart people or intelligent people in the Bible, I actually typically don't think of Jesus. I think of he's a good teacher, he heals, he's God, but I don't think of Jesus as high IQ necessarily. I think of Paul. If I want to climb the intellectual, theological Himalayas, I'm going to go to Paul. But Jesus here shows like rhetorical ninja skills. Because when they say, yeah, this guy's casting out demons, he's possessed by the devil. What does Jesus say? This is a mic drop moment for Jesus. He says, how can Satan cast out Satan? Now, if I'm one of those guys who's throwing the accusation, I'm looking at my friend and saying, oh, guy, what do we say to that? He's got us out. I mean, I have no idea what to say to that guy. He's right. How could Satan cast out Satan? So at this point, Jesus is accused of being crazy. He's accused of being demon-possessed. He's done pretty remarkable things. He's healed many, including a paralyzed man. He's cast out demons from people. Then we catch up right to the context leading up to this. He shows control and authority over weather and the sea. And the sea, in the Jewish mind, the sea was a place of chaos. It was known as Sheol. So to have authority over the sea was a very big deal. It wasn't just another miracle. It was saying, wow, this is supernatural, clearly supernatural stuff that this guy's doing. And there are plots to kill Jesus. So he's aware of this. Jesus is aware of all of this. And that's when we come to Mark chapter 5, and this passage particularly, 21, verse 21. When we enter the story, we hear the words from Mark, the narrator, saying that Jesus crossed over again in the boat. Now, the reason why that is important is because to translate that as to what he's telling us there, he's telling us that Jesus is now entering back into Jewish territory. And that's going to be really important because that's giving us a window into how the people in that context where Jesus interacts with Jairus and how he interacts with the woman, that's going to give us a lens into how they would have understood what Jesus is doing. Then Mark says that there's a large crowd that gathered around him. Now, what that means at least two things. One, it means that Jesus' popularity is growing. Now, there's a large crowd that's following him. But it also says another thing. It says that there's a deterrent. It means that, actually, if you want easy access to Jesus, that's done. That game is done now. You do not have easy access to Jesus because there are a lot of people who want a piece. So his popularity is growing, but also it's hard to get into Jesus. It's hard to get to him. And this is when we see that there's a leader from the synagogue named Jairus who approaches him. And it's not just this, hi, Jesus, I don't think we've met before. My name is Jairus. No, that's not how he approaches him. He falls down at Jesus' feet. Highly dramatic. Even in our Pacific Northwestern 21st century context, that would be dramatic for a grown male to fall down at another person's feet. But especially first century Palestine, in the Middle Eastern context, for a guy, males that had high status. There was a lot of respect for the male, especially compared to women in that day. For a grown man to fall at another's feet was a highly undignifying thing to do. But we soon find out why, because now when he gets to Jesus' feet, he's begging, he's pleading Jesus to come to his house because his daughter, and what we know from the other Gospels tell us that actually this is his only daughter. This is his only daughter. He's pleading with Jesus to come heal his daughter because his daughter is dying. So what we find from Mark in this particularly chapter 5, verse 24, to understand how would Jesus respond? Well, Mark tells us he went with him. So that gives us some indication. All we know is this much. Jesus he's going with Jairus to his house. So they're on a mission. And the mission is go to Jairus' house and heal Jairus' daughter. And this is where the mission, to put it one way, it's sort of hijacked. Because on the way to the house, this woman with a chronic illness. It's a menstrual hemorrhage illness in which she had abnormal perpetual bleeding, and she's dealt with this. She has endured this for 12 years. She falls at Jesus' feet. Actually, I'm getting ahead of it. Let me back up a second. She doesn't actually face him face to face. It's actually quite different to Jairus. She actually tries to just she wants to get in and get out, get the healing and get out. She touches Jesus' garments. Now we're to imagine, in that context, Jesus wearing a robe and tassels at the bottom of his robe, and she's pulling on these tassels because she feels if I can just touch his garment, I will be made whole. And that's exactly what happens. She touches Jesus' robe, and she feels the blood in her body dry up, and Jesus at the same time feels that power has gone from him. So he's looking around, and his disciples are a bit puzzled because there's a crowd. Of course, when he says, hey, who touched me? They're looking at him and saying, Jesus, there are a lot of people here. But he knows something has happened, and eventually she comes, she comes clean. She tells him the truth, and then Jesus looks at her and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Now, what's interesting, again, this whole thing, Mark is telling a story and is going just very, very fast. At the same time, while she gets healed and she confesses to Jesus, people come to Jairus and say, hey, look, stop bothering this guy. Stop bothering Jesus. He's too busy. And also, by the way, your daughter is dead. And Mark tells us that Jesus actually overhears that. And he looks to Jairus and says, do not fear. Only believe. They enter the house, they get to Jairus' house, and when they enter the house, they find people who are weeping, they're mourning. They're actually, in that context, in the Jewish community, Jewish culture, they had professional mourners. So when a family member would die, professional mourners would come, and what that made, it made a space comfortable for the family to lament, to weep, to wail and cry. But Jesus comes in, he sees it, and he says, hey, what's going on? Why all the commotion? Why all the weeping? This girl is not dead, she's sleeping, to which they laugh at him. And Mark again, it's slightly diplomatic in saying how Jesus asked them to leave, but there's some force. Jesus is not happy with this group of people who are laughing at him. They leave, and Jesus goes into the daughter's room with Jairus' wife, and some of Jesus' closest friends. He takes the daughter's hand and says to her in these Aramaic words, Talitha Kumi, which literally means in Aramaic, arise, lamb. These are words of tenderness and affection. They actually, it would translate to us saying our son or daughter, honey, wake up. It's very tender what Jesus says to this girl. And she does wake up. This 12-year-old girl, she is healed. Jesus heals her. And what we see in the narrative is they are all immediately overcome with amazement. And ever practical Jesus looks at them and says, please get her something to eat. And that's how this cluster ends. So how do these stories, there's a lot that we've just looked at just briefly here. We're going to sort of do somewhat of a deep dive here. But how do these stories speak to our questions around what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to live with faith? And then also, how does this passage speak to the question of what is God like? Well, first let's look at the faith question. The faith question. Now, as I was reading and studying this passage, I put together an acronym that I think captures something of what it means to have faith. Now, if I can get that slide up there. What I called it is faith is falling all in to him. You don't necessarily need a slide. It's not actually, I'm not too tech savvy when it comes to this. But faith is simply as falling all in to him. Falling all into Jesus. What does that mean? Well, it's sort of obvious, but the common ground here, when you look at how faith begins, where faith begins for both Jairus and the woman, it begins really with falling down at Jesus' feet. Verse 22, Jairus falls at his feet. Verse 33, the woman falls down at his feet. Faith, what that tells us is faith begins with worship. Faith begins with us saying, I'm weak, you are strong. God, you know more than me. I know less than you. There's a real irony, actually, when we think of physical growth as a human being, when someone actually matures, and when someone matures and grows as a follower of Christ. When we think of a person who has grown up, we think of the more a person grows, the more a person is independent. They can make decisions on their own. They can do things, and they can make good decisions. We would think of that person as, hey, they've grown up. They are an adult now. But the irony is, as a person who grows as a follower and a friend of Jesus, it's actually not a reflection of greater independence. No, it's greater dependence on Jesus. The more we grow in Christ, the more dependent we should be on him, not more independent. That's an irony and a contrast between just how we associate physical maturation with how we mature into faithful witnesses, faithful followers of Jesus. Now, let me just stop there for a moment. Because when we look at these two individuals, Jairus and this woman with this chronic illness, they could not be further apart in terms of on the cultural spectrum. Jairus is this guy who actually, he has some status. He's a leader of the synagogue. But the biggest thing probably that differentiates the two is that he's, a man, she's a woman. And in that culture, women were looked down upon. And let me just stay there for a moment. For Jesus to even interact with a woman in first century Palestinian context, as a Jewish man in public, that would have even been looked down upon. So just by Jesus interacting with this woman, he elevates her status. Now, for him to interact with Jairus, that's not as much of a deal. But Jesus, just by interacting with this woman, he bypasses the social taboos of the culture because she is important to him. Now, what's also interesting when we look at the difference, Jairus and the woman, is Jairus is associated, or he's understood by his name. Jairus. She is understood by how? By her shame. That she has this illness. Now, again, we come back to the Jewish context through which Mark wants us to understand the story. In that immediate context, in Jewish culture, Israelite tradition, she was deemed ceremonially unclean. So she has taken hits at multiple levels. One, physically. Like the most obvious thing is physically she's had to endure this horrendous illness for 12 years. But that's one thing. The other thing is Mark actually tells us in detail that she has suffered at the hands of doctors. So she is lost at a financial standpoint. Also, you've got to think that emotionally, mentally, physically, the whole thing is taxing. But probably the biggest thing that is felt and all pervasive in this moment is that she's not supposed to be out there. Physically, because of where she's at, she should not be in a crowd. 2, she should definitely not be touching anybody. And she touches Jesus' clothes. Now, here's the thing. There are a lot of differences. There are a lot of differences between Jairus and this woman. But the common ground is that they're both desperate. They're out of options. They're afraid. And they all put their trust in Jesus. That's the common ground. The common ground is they both put their trust in Jesus. Now here we come to the lower bit. So faith is, yes, it's falling. In other words, it's desperation. It's dependence. Saying, Jesus, you're it. You're the thing. I'm done without you. I'm out of options. But the to him part is important because when we think of faith, it's very unfortunate, but we think of faith often in terms of the amount. And unfortunately, I'm not sure about you, but I've actually heard many messages, unfortunately, that use this text as a proof text for you've just got to dig down and have enough faith. So what happens, unfortunately, the long game of that idea that faith is focused on the amount is getting, putting it sort of in crude terms, getting a healing or getting a miracle is basically on you. It's on us. It's on me. I'm on the hook for that. So either I've got to have the faith and we get the deal done, or I don't and we're sunk. And this actually can be good. If something good happens, often we say, oh, that guy, he had the faith. And I couldn't have the faith, but he had the faith, and they got that miracle. Or if they don't, I don't know if you've ever had this conversation, sometimes it's like things go disastrous, and you're like, I just didn't have enough faith. Now, the very good news to those scenarios is actually those are not rooted in Scripture. That's very good news. That takes the edge off. No, the focus of faith is actually Him. The center of faith is not the amount, it's actually the object of our faith. Where is your trust located? That's the thing. Faith is not, the focus of Christian faith is not how much, it's actually who is the object of our trust. That's what makes Jairus' faith unique. That's what makes this woman's faith unique. Not that they're actually, man, they really dug down deep for this one. Oh, wow, they're pretty unique. No, it's actually that their trust is both. Both their trust is located in Jesus. He's the thing. He's the one who's going to make it work. Now, we have a problem, though. And the problem is that there are competing voices in our lives. And we see that on display here. There are always, almost part of being a human being is that there are always competing narratives. That there are always competing voices. And we see this in actually quite a poignant, almost emotional level when Jairus is there with Jesus. And this woman is healed almost a matter of seconds, according to the narrative. After she is healed, people come to Jairus and tell him to stop bothering Jesus. Your daughter is dead, Jairus. Stop bothering Jesus. And Jesus tells Jairus, don't fear, only believe. Now, there are many reasons as to why Jesus would have said that. But I wonder if actually one reason is because Jesus saw what was happening in Jairus' heart and mind. He heard what's happening. Jairus, don't be afraid. I heard what they said. I heard what they said, Jairus. Don't fear. Put your eyes on me. Trust me. Trust me. Put your trust in me, Jairus. The other part as to why, the other reason why Jesus might have actually said this to Jairus is because of the moment. Jairus has just seen this woman put her trust in Jesus. So part of why Jesus might be saying this is almost a way of saying, Jairus, did you see how she just acted there? She trusted in me. Do what she's doing. Do what she's done. Trust in me. Do not be afraid. So the question that comes from all of this is a very real question. And it's this. What are the voices we are listening to? One of the one of the greatest gifts we have to offer anyone right now is our attention. What are we paying attention to? What are we listening to? And really getting to the heart of the matter, are we listening to the voice of Jesus? When it comes to, could be work, could be a work situation, could be a financial decision, could be in our marriage, could be with our kids, could be with a colleague, a friend, a daughter, a son, where Jesus might be saying to you, might be saying to me, don't fear. Don't fear. Trust in me. Trust in me. I know what's happening. Don't fear. Trust in me. Especially when we think of just even our current cultural moment. The different voices of fear. Jesus says to us, do not fear. Trust in me. So we look at faith. Faith is falling all in to him. Falling all in to Jesus. Now we look to the second question. What do these stories tell us about the character and nature of God? Well, first, it tells us that this God, he will go with us. He goes with us. When Jairus pleads with Jesus to come and heal his daughter, we read these words, and he went with him. And he went with him. No matter what, so what that means is no matter where we are in our journey of faith, when we call out to Jesus, he goes with us. His presence goes with us. Now, a fundamental need that we have as human beings is the act of presence. But not only the act of presence, but act of loving presence. When I don't know about you, but when I'm in a hard place, a difficult time, maybe frustration or feeling lonely, what I desire is someone who's not only going to be with me, but someone who loves me. Not necessarily to fix it, but just be with me, just to be with me in that moment. Years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, our daughter Saskia, all the kids were in the backyard, and Saskia was in the backyard playing, and she had this stick. That was the first mistake. Jumping around with a stick. We've learned her lesson, but she was jumping around with a stick, and somehow, I'm not sure how it happened, we didn't see it, but somehow the stick went into her mouth and hit the back of her mouth, and it cut the back of her mouth. And she started crying and yelling. We didn't know what happened, so we eventually found out what had happened, and we tried to clean it out. We could just barely see the back of her mouth. There was this cut, and we just cleaned it out with just water at the time, and we couldn't see the cut anymore. The next day, still no improvement, and slowly getting worse. So we took her to our pediatrician, and he checked her out and said, look, it looks okay right now, but if she doesn't get any better, if she gets worse, then bring her back in a couple days. So that's what we did, because it actually did get worse. We took her back, and then eventually, after running different tests, we drove down to Tacoma, to the Children's Hospital. And it became very serious after doing, I think, different scans, that she had this infection at the back, but it was very close to the spine by this point. So they thought, look, we're going to give her antibiotics, or if those don't work, we'll have to have a procedure here, have to operate it. So I was afraid. Full disclosure, I was afraid in that moment. So Brittany stayed with her in the hospital. I, had the kids back home, and we would go visit each day. And just the good news is it ended well. The antibiotics worked, the infection went down, and a few days in the hospital, and then they returned home. But just a few months ago,
we were at the dinner table, and I said to Saskia, I said, hey, what do you remember from that? Because, Mommy and Daddy, we were stressed. We were worried about you. But what do you remember from that time in the hospital? And she'd said different things, and then I'll never forget, she looked at us and said, one of the things I really liked is how Mommy was next to me in the bed when we were in the hospital. Presence. Jesus goes with us. God goes with you. He goes with us. When we call to him, he gives us his presence. This passage also tells us that he not only goes with us, he sees us. An important detail that sometimes gets unnoticed in these stories is that Jesus sees both these individuals. He sees Jairus. He pays attention to Jairus. And when the woman finally comes out of going stealth mode and covert, get in and get out with the healing, and reveals herself, Jesus pays attention to her. He sees her. Now, have you ever been in a conversation with someone, engaged in a conversation, maybe at a get-together or a party, possibly at church, where you're talking to someone, but they don't really see you? So you're talking to them and like, yeah. And you can just tell, you're not really important to this person because they're actually looking at someone else. They have someone else in mind in the lobby. And so you're feeling like, hey, hold on a second. Like, hey, I'm important. I've got something important to say here too, Like, it's not just that guy over there. They're not really looking at you. Has that ever happened, or is that just me? I've actually had that happen many times. But there's a problem here because you're having a conversation, but the person isn't really paying attention to you. Well, when you look to Jesus, you'll never actually see that happen. Jesus gives his full attention to Jairus and to the woman. Listen to the words of what the Christian psychiatrist Kurt Thompson once wrote. He wrote these words: "We all are born into the world looking for someone, looking for us. We remain in this mode of searching for the rest of our lives." Let me read that again. We all are born into the world looking for someone, looking for us. And we remain in this mode of searching for the rest of our lives. Now, what is he saying? Well, what Thompson is saying there is that fundamental to being a human person is that we're always in this constant mode of wherever we go, enter a room, whether it be at school, college, the dining hall at our workplace, or the water cooler, or church, a get-together. We're always in this mode of looking for someone who's actually looking for us. I remember years ago, I hadn't seen a group of friends, and it was a month, but we used to be close. And I remember getting together for a get-together, and I entered the room, and I felt a bit awkward, and all of a sudden this guy came around the corner. He's like, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. And all of a sudden, I was put at ease because there was someone in that room who was looking for me. We all are born into the world looking for someone who's actually looking for us. This is just a relational truth. Now, this is ultimately, most profoundly and supremely met and answered in the person of Jesus. Because in our search, we find that actually he has been looking for us. He's looking for you. He's looking for me. Now, what's interesting in these stories is both Jairus and the woman, they're coming to Jesus, but they've got a purpose. And the purpose is, I have a need. They both have a need. They come to Jesus with a need. He comes to them just for a meal. They come to Jesus for a miracle. He comes to them for an encounter. Because needs are important to Jesus, but what's more important is actually you and I. Because that sort of cuts through the whole noise of why we meet with Jesus on a regular basis. It's not actually, you've got to get this thing done, got to get this box ticked. No, it's ultimately for an encounter through the scriptures, through worship, through listening, through prayer. The whole game, the whole business is actually encountering this God who's actually looking for us. Listen to what one commentator says. He puts it like this: discipleship is not simply getting our needs met, it is being in the presence of Jesus, being known by him, and following him. Discipleship, now let me just stop there. Needs are very important. They are important to Jesus, but they're not the whole thing, not even close. Discipleship, as this person says, is not simply getting our needs met. It is being in the presence of Jesus, being known by him, and following him. Jesus goes with us. He goes with you. He sees you. I can tell you that I've been in moments in my life, I've experienced moments when I actually don't feel that Jesus sees me. And I'm thinking to myself, God, hey, do you see me in this moment right now? Do you see what's happening? And what these stories tell me is he absolutely sees me. He sees you no matter where you are today. In the highs, in the lows, in the moments of success or frustration, crisis, tragedy, loss, victory, he sees us. Who is this God? He's a God who actually goes with us, he sees us, and he is compassionate. What we find in these stories is that there's compassion, and we see this not only in how Jesus acts, but also what he says. You hear it probably most pronounced when Jesus comes to this girl and speaks to her in her language, Aramaic. Talitha, kumi. Honey, wake up. Arise. The interesting thing about this word compassion is that it's used to describe God in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, but then also in the New Testament. And the word, it comes from Latin. It's a compound word. So first it means you pass moral judgment upon something. In other words, you see something as wrong. But compassion doesn't stop there. It moves you so deep within that you do something about it. This is why it's actually deeply profound when we hear the words compassion to describe the God that we serve. Let me tell a story. Years ago, when Brittany and I, we were living in England, we had just started dating. And I remember we went out to this one restaurant one evening. And after this date, I like to think of it as a romantic date. We left the restaurant and then walked down the street to the bus stop. And while we were walking down the street, people came to us and started asking us for money, which in this particular city there, it wasn't unusual. But what was unusual is that they became belligerent and started using force and started pushing us. And I remember being pushed against the glass window of a shop, and they then split us, this group split us apart, and punching and pulling. And I remember specifically seeing them pull Brittany's hair. It was a very mean and cruel thing that they were doing. But we actually, maybe we should have just said, look, here's 10 pounds, you just have what we've got. But both of us were like, no, you're not getting this. Anyway, they were both beating us up, okay? If you can picture this group. And it's not nighttime yet, but it's also not busy. So not many people around. But then this one guy walks down the street, and I look at him, I yell at him, hey, look, see what's happening? They're beating us up. I just need one guy to help me. We can do this. You're laughing. Yeah, well, you'll laugh even more because the guy actually didn't even acknowledge me. Rightfully so. He probably thought, man, this guy is, whoa. There's no way I'm getting close to that. And he didn't even acknowledge me. I was like a ghost to this guy. Then another person, the next victim, walked past me. And I yelled out to him the same thing. Hey, look, I just need some help. Do you see what's happening? They're beating us up. I just need one guy to help me out here. And he just yelled back, call the police. And I was so paralyzed with fear in that moment. I asked him, what's the number? Seriously. Now, for those of you who've been in the UK, you know that the emergency number is 999. It's our 911. But I didn't even know that at the time. So I'm really, and this ship is tanking in a hurry. It's already in the panic mode. And then I see this guy who's they have these kebabs that they sell. It's like basically the equivalent to hot dog or sausage vendors that we'd have here. And he has these French fries that he's selling, and he's this big man, okay? And I do the same thing. Hey, do you see what's happening? I need your help. See, they're beating us up. I just need one guy. And like a shot, he opened this gate from his kebab van and bolted out there. And it was like Hollywood-esque. He just pulled the people off of us. And I just grabbed Brittany and we ran and got a taxi and we got out of town and back to where we lived at our student house. Now, there was a lot of fear in that moment. But what that guy did was he embodied compassion because he saw something that was wrong. And then he did something about it. This is why when we look to Jesus, this God of compassion, it's a very profound word used to describe Jesus, that he sees something wrong with us and he does something about it. It does not stop at pity, saying, man, that's hard. That's really difficult. No, he sees something wrong with us and he does something about it. He saw something wrong with Jairus' daughter. He did something about it. He saw something wrong with the woman with this chronic illness, and he did something about it. Jesus sees you today. He goes with us, and he is compassionate. Do you know this God? Have you encountered him? We come to Jesus with our needs. He comes to us for a meeting, for an encounter. Faith, falling all into him. Jesus, you're it. I'm done without you. I'm out of options. You are it, Jesus. I depend on you. You are the source of my trust. These two stories, I think, help us understand and get a hold of what it means to live with faith, even when we might be experiencing or feeling fear. It tells us something of who this God is, a God who goes with us, who sees us, and is compassionate. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that you see us. Thank you that we are never alone, that you go with us. For those of us who feel as though we don't feel seen, we don't feel your presence in this moment, Lord, would you help us to know your presence? To somehow be aware that you are attentive to us. Please minister to us, Lord. We need you. You are our only hope. go with us in each step of our journey, I pray. In Christ's name, amen.